The wind screamed across the open prairie, cold and relentless, as if daring anyone to stake a claim on this wild stretch of earth. Rain churned the soil into clinging mud, and clouds like bruised flesh rolled over the mountains in the distance. Yet in the middle of that desolate plain, a woman wrestled with a log nearly twice her weight, dragging it across the ground with a rope slung around her shoulders like a yoke. Eleanor Harper, Ellie to the husband she'd buried less than a year ago, tightened her grip, gritted her teeth, and heaved. The log shifted a few inches, then stalled again. Her boots slipped. The muscles in her arms trembled. She didn't curse or cry. She simply tried again. From the ridge above, a man watched in silence, rain dripping from the brim of his weathered hat. His name was Thomas Boone, a former Union scout and a widower of 5 years. He'd intended to pass through this land without stopping, heading west to nowhere in particular, as he had been for months, but the sight of her had rooted him to the spot like an old tree. She was alone. No neighbors for miles. No horse in sight. And she wasn't just stacking logs, she was building something. A cabin, crudely shaped but carefully laid. A hearth already in place, stone by stone. It looked like the kind of structure someone started with love and finished with spite. He'd seen desperate people before, runaways, dreamers, drunkards clawing for a second chance, but this was different. She wasn't running. She was claiming. She didn't know he was there. Not yet. He wasn't sure why he hadn't ridden on, but something about her stubbornness gripped him. It reminded him of his wife, before the fever took her. The way she'd clenched her jaw in labor, bleeding and laughing all the same. He remembered that kind of fire, and he hadn't seen it in a long time. Ellie finally rolled the log into place with a grunt and collapsed to her knees, chest heaving. Her hands were torn and swollen, fingernails blackened from splinters. She sat back on her heels and stared at the cabin's skeletal frame. A breeze whistled through the gaps. Her eyes were hollow but unbroken. Later that night, as stars pushed through the clouds, Ellie sat by a meager fire, knees hugged to her chest, staring into the flames. The cold crept into her bones. She rubbed her arms and glanced at the outline of the cabin, just a few feet away. It looked more like a grave marker than a home. In the shadows just beyond the firelight, a mountain lion prowled. Its paws pressed silently into the mud as it crept closer, amber eyes fixed on her small figure. Boone, still hidden behind the trees, raised his rifle. One breath. Thump. Then a single shot cracked the air, echoing across the hills. The cat yowled and vanished into the dark. Ellie jumped to her feet, pistol drawn, spinning in all directions. But there was no one. Just the embers, crackling like bones in the cold. She scanned the tree line, heart pounding. Then she saw it, paw prints in the mud. Huge. Fresh. And next to them, boot prints. The next morning, she followed the tracks into the forest, but they ended near the riverbank. No campfire, no rider. Just absence. She returned to her half-built home and found something strange. The log she'd struggled with last night had been shaped at both ends, as if someone had returned and worked on it while she slept. The days that followed brought rain, wind, and silence. Ellie worked alone, keeping her pistol within reach. Her food stores were low. She began rationing, chewing dry jerky until her jaw ached. Her nights were filled with uneasy dreams, hoofbeats in the dark, laughter from men she couldn't see, the sound of her husband's voice calling from the woods. Then came the storm. It rolled in fast and brutal. The sky turned greenish-black as thunder cracked like distant gunfire. Ellie scrambled to cover her tools, but a gust ripped the tarp from her hands. Lightning lit the field like daylight, and then the wind hit. The frame of the cabin groaned. A corner beam tilted dangerously. She ran for it, arms outstretched, trying to brace the beam as it threatened to collapse. Rain blinded her. Her boots slid in the mud. The log groaned again, toppling toward her. She braced for the crush of wood and weight. Then strong arms grabbed the beam from behind, yanking it back into place. She turned, blinking through the rain. Boone stood there, soaked to the bone, shoulders hunched, hands locked around the log like a dying man gripping a cross. Neither spoke. They worked together in frantic rhythm, securing the frame with rope and makeshift braces. Wind howled, and the world shrank to mud and motion. When the storm broke, Ellie sat by the fire once more, this time with Boone beside her. He didn't say his name. She didn't ask. "You've been watching," she said. He nodded. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a flask from his coat and handed it to her. She drank. It burned going down. "You shouldn't be alone out here," he said finally. "I am," she replied. Boone looked at the sky, then back at her. "Ain't a reason." She tossed the flask back to him. "I had a husband. We came west to build this place together. He died before we even found the land. Snakebite." Boone lowered his eyes. "I wasn't going to let the dream die with him," she added, voice like gravel. "You're bleeding," he said, nodding to her palms. Ellie looked down. Blood trickled from a torn blister. She flexed her fingers, then wrapped her hands in her shawl. Boone stood to leave. "I'll be nearby," he said. "This land draws trouble. I'm used to trouble." He gave her a long look. Not pity, not warning, just understanding. Then he walked into the trees and vanished. The next morning, Ellie stepped outside and froze. Another log had been shaped and laid out beside her worksite. Clean cuts, smoothed ends. She didn't smile, but her shoulders sank in quiet relief. She picked up her axe. The wind had calmed. Somewhere in the trees, she knew, the stranger was still watching. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel entirely alone. Boone returned 6 days later, trailing the scent of smoke and gunpowder on his coat. He didn't announce himself, just stepped out of the timberline as Ellie split kindling beneath a pale morning sun. She didn't flinch. She simply nodded once, then went back to her axe. He said little as usual. His horse looked thinner than before, and the rifle on his back bore fresh scratches. When she offered him coffee that night by the fire, he accepted without a word, and they sat in a silence made companionable by crackling embers. The next morning, without being asked, Boone lifted a log and shouldered it toward the cabin's sidewall. Ellie watched him for a beat, then returned to her own labor. They worked in tandem all day, trading few words but many glances. He noticed how she favored her left arm, likely from a poorly healed break, and she noticed how he always checked the ridge line before sundown, like a soldier counting ghosts. Boone had seen war. It clung to him in the way he moved, deliberate, quiet, half expecting trouble to rise from the grass. But this place wasn't shaped by bullets. It was carved by isolation, and that carried its own kind of weight. That evening, Ellie finally broke the quiet between them. "You always watching the hills?" He didn't look up. "There are men roaming. Raiders. Drifters. Some looking for a place. Some looking for someone to bleed." Ellie nodded, a flash of tension behind her eyes. "I heard shots a few nights ago. North Ridge. I went to see," he said. "A cabin burned. Widow and her boy barely got out. She swallowed hard. She survived." She did. He didn't. They sat with the weight of it. The fire between them snapped and hissed. Ellie didn't ask why he was still around. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. Later, as the moon edged above the treetops, Boone stirred the fire with a branch and asked, "Why this place?" "My husband picked it," she said. "Said the land would feed us. Said the hills reminded him of Tennessee." Boone looked around, his eyes catching on the unfinished walls, the threadbare canvas she used as a roof. "Hard ground for memories." "It's not about the ground," she said quietly. "It's about not giving up." The next day, a third figure arrived, a man on foot, his clothes earth-toned and worn, with hair braided tight and a flint knife at his side. He moved like a shadow. Ellie reached for her rifle but paused when Boone raised a hand. "His name's Red Elk," Boone said. "He doesn't talk much, but he sees everything." Red Elk approached the fire with a nod, said nothing, then crouched and began to heat a stone in the coals. Ellie watched him warily, unsure of his presence, until Boone added, "He saved my life in Wyoming. Blizzard came down like God himself wanted to start over." Red Elk glanced at Ellie and spoke, his voice low and precise. "Bandits followed you. 3 days back. They camped where the pines lean west." Boone frowned. "How many?" "6. Maybe 7. They carry rope, not food." Ellie understood that kind of threat. They weren't just thieves, they were men who took what they wanted, and didn't ask if it breathed. She tightened her jaw and excused herself to her tent. That night, she barely slept. At dawn, they heard distant gunfire. One shot. Then another, farther off. Boone rode out immediately, and Ellie, despite his warning to stay, followed on foot with her rifle slung over her shoulder. They reached the burnt remains of a neighboring cabin by midday. The air was thick with the stench of ash and blood. A woman knelt in the dirt, cradling a singed Bible, her eyes raw and distant. Boone dismounted and offered her water. She refused. Ellie crouched beside the charred frame and found a child's boot, melted halfway into the earth. Her fingers trembled as she set it down. "They left a message," Boone said, holding up a splintered board with the words scrawled in soot, "You're next." On the way back, the world seemed colder. Ellie said little, and Boone didn't press. But when they stopped by a stream to refill their canteens, she asked, almost in a whisper, "Do you have any children?" Boone stared at the water for a long time before answering. "I did. A boy. Samuel." "What happened?" "Fever took him. Same as his mother. 1 week, and they were both gone." Ellie closed her eyes. "I was pregnant when my husband died. We were supposed to build this place before the winter came. I gave birth in the cold. Alone." Boone looked at her, his face a quiet ruin. "The child?" "Stillborn," she said. "I buried them both under the pines." There was nothing more to say. Pain didn't need explanation. It just needed space. That night, as they sat beside the fire once again, Red Elk returned, blood on his shoulder, a gash across his jaw. He leaned heavily against a tree, eyes dark with urgency. "They're moving," he said. "Tonight." Boone stood immediately. Ellie rose too. Red Elk wiped blood from his brow. "They want your land. But they want your fear more." Boone turned to Ellie, his voice low and calm. "We'll make a stand." She met his eyes. "Then let them come." And somewhere out beyond the timberline, 7 men lit torches and mounted their horses.